What if everything you believe about failure is wrong? Because history tells a very different story. This is not a story about failure. This is a story about what happens after everything breaks.
September 28, 1928, in London, England. Inside a quiet laboratory at St. Mary's Hospital, Alexander Fleming returned to his work, expecting nothing unusual. But as he looked at one of his petri dishes, something was clearly wrong. The experiment had been contaminated. In most cases, this would have been ignored, discarded, and forgotten without a second thought. It was, by every definition, a failed experiment, but instead of throwing it away, he paused. There was something unusual about the contamination. A mold had formed, and around it, the bacteria were disappearing. What looked like a mistake was doing something unexpected. That single moment of curiosity changed everything. Because that failed experiment would later lead to the discovery of penicillin, one of the most important medical breakthroughs in human history, saving millions of lives across generations, and yet, at the moment it happened, no one called it success. It looked like failure. And that is where this story truly begins, because this pattern does not exist only in laboratories. It appears in history, in nations, and in moments that seem like collapse, but quietly force something new to emerge. April 9th, 1865, Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. The American Civil War was reaching its end. Robert E. Lee stood in a position where the outcome was already decided. His army was exhausted, outnumbered and surrounded. There was no strategy left, no path forward, no possibility of victory. Only one decision remained: surrender. For the Confederacy, this moment represented total failure, a lost war, a broken system, and an entire way of life coming to an end. But the real impact of that moment was not just defeat, it was what came after. Because that surrender forced the United States to confront its deepest internal conflict: slavery, unity, and the meaning of freedom itself. The war did not simply end a battle, it ended a structure. And when a structure ends, something else must take its place. The Reconstruction era did not begin from victory, but from destruction, from a nation that had no choice but to redefine itself. And this is where the pattern becomes clearer. Failure does not always destroy a system. Sometimes it exposes what can no longer continue and forces change that would not have been possible otherwise. But this pattern did not stop there. Because years later, on the other side of the world, another moment would unfold. One that looked like complete devastation, yet would reshape an entire nation. August 6, 1945, Hiroshima, Japan. At exactly 8:15 in the morning, the sky above the city changed in a way no one had ever seen before. A single flash brighter than the sun cut through the air, and within seconds, entire neighborhoods disappeared. Buildings collapsed into dust, streets were erased, and thousands of lives were lost in an instant. It did not feel like defeat. It felt like the end of everything. 3 days later, another bomb fell on Nagasaki, and by that point, there was no longer a path forward. Japan, once one of the most powerful military forces in the world, was facing a reality it could not avoid. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito addressed the nation, announcing surrender. For millions of people, this was absolute failure, a complete collapse of power, identity, and future. But history did not end there, because what followed was something few could have imagined at the time. In the years after the war, Japan did not remain in ruin. Instead, it began to rebuild, not just physically, but structurally. Its political system changed, its priorities shifted, and its direction as a nation was completely redefined. The focus moved away from military expansion and toward economic growth, technological development, and long-term stability. Factories replaced battlefields, innovation replaced destruction, and within a few decades, Japan emerged as one of the most advanced and influential economies in the world. What once looked like total devastation became the starting point of transformation. And this is where the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. a failed experiment that led to discovery, a lost war that forced a nation to redefine itself, a destroyed country that rebuilt into something entirely new. These moments are different in scale and context, but they follow the same underlying structure. Pressure builds, failure occurs, and then something changes, not instantly, not easily, but inevitably. Because when a system reaches a point where it can no longer continue as it was, change is no longer optional. It becomes necessary, and that raises a deeper question. If failure can lead to transformation, then what actually defines failure? Because in the moment it happens, it always feels final. But history keeps showing us something else, a slower, less visible process, where outcomes are shaped not by the failure itself, but by what happens after it. After every major failure in history, there is a moment that most people never see. Not the collapse itself, not the headlines, but what happens inside the system after everything breaks. Because this is where the real outcome is decided, not by what was lost, but by how the system responds next. Some systems react emotionally, others resist change, and if you are forced to transform completely. The difference between them is not strength, power, or size. It is something less visible, but far more important: accountability. Accountability is not just a rule or a law. It is a process, a structure that forces systems to confront their own mistakes. It creates pressure to review decisions, to question outcomes, and to respond before problems grow beyond control. When accountability is strong, failure does not spread. It is contained, examined, and corrected before it turns into something larger. But when accountability begins to weaken, the system starts to change in ways that are difficult to notice at first. Decisions are no longer questioned. Mistakes are quietly ignored. Patterns begin to repeat, not because they are correct, but because nothing is stopping them. And over time, those patterns begin to build pressure beneath the surface. This is where the real shift happens. Not suddenly, but slowly, almost invisibly, until the system reaches a point where it can no longer correct itself. And when that happens, failure is no longer just a moment in time. It becomes a direction, a continuous movement away from stability, where every new decision pushes the system further out of balance. This is why some systems recover after failure, while others collapse completely. Because recovery requires one critical ability: the ability to recognize what went wrong and respond to it. Without that, failure does not lead to transformation. It leads to repetition. In the United States after the Civil War, that response came through Reconstruction, through new laws, amendments, and structural changes that attempted to reshape the nation. In Japan after World War II, that response came through reform, economic rebuilding, institutional shifts, and long-term planning that changed the country's direction. In both cases, the system did not ignore failure. It was forced to confront it. And because of that, it was able to move forward. Not perfectly, not without conflict, but with enough change to avoid complete collapse. Now think about this for a moment. What happens when a system no longer does that? When it no longer questions itself? When it no longer corrects its own direction? Because at that point, failure does not lead to transformation anymore. It leads somewhere else, somewhere much harder to reverse. And this is where the pattern becomes more than just history. Because it is not something that only happened in the past. It is something that continues, even now, in ways that are not always obvious. Today, we live in a world shaped by systems more complex than ever before. Governments, economies, technologies, and global institutions operate at a scale that is difficult to fully understand. And on the surface, many of these systems appear stable, functional, controlled, and consistent. But history has already shown us something important. Stability does not mean permanence. Because every system, no matter how powerful, eventually faces pressure. And when that pressure builds, the same question always appears. Can the system still correct itself? Or has it lost that ability? Because that is the line that separates transformation from collapse. If a system can still question its own decisions, if it can still respond to its own mistakes, if accountability still exists, then failure becomes a turning point. It becomes a moment of adjustment where change happens before the system breaks completely. But if that process stops, if decisions are no longer examined, if mistakes are repeated without consequence, then failure does not remain contained. It spreads, slowly at first, almost invisible, and then all at once. And by the time it becomes visible, it is often too late to reverse. This is why history matters. Not because it simply tells us what happened, but because it reveals patterns that continue even when we are not paying attention. And once you begin to see those patterns, something changes. Moments that once looked like failure begin to look different. They become signals, warnings, indicators that something deeper is shifting beneath the surface. And that changes how you see everything from global events to everyday decisions, because failure is no longer just an ending. It becomes information, a signal that something is no longer working the way it should. Something that needs to change before the system reaches its limit. The real danger is not failure itself. It is ignoring what failure is trying to show. Because when that happens, systems don't just break. They continue without correction, moving in the wrong direction until the outcome becomes unavoidable. And now, after seeing this pattern across history, from a small laboratory in London to the end of a civil war, to the rebuilding of an entire nation, one question remains. Are we recognizing these movements today? Or are we calling them failure and missing what they truly mean?